Everyone, let's just state the obvious. I'm less biased than you are. And I know there's a couple things that make you more biased when it comes to choosing what music we should listen to. I would never do that. Nah, come on now. Everyone is a bit biased. I mean, it's what makes us human after all. But it almost sounded as if I did not recognize or identify the fact that I may be biased as well. This is sadly a case of a bias blind spot. And Bo Bennett simply describes it as the tendency for one to see themselves as less biased than others, or for one to identify more cognitive bias in others than in oneself. In a study done with 661 participants, nearly 85% said that they were less biased than others. Now, why is that so important? Well, it shows that this cognitive bias affects many people, and the problem is that they cannot see it. People hate to admit that they're biased, but the truth comes from the way our brain works. And there are different things that influence it, such as our culture, our preference, and our self-esteem. So let's take a seat and talk about the different issues that arises when someone falls victim to a bias blind spot. Problems are, but not limited to, the distortion of one's reality, making poor decisions, and lastly, it makes it harder for people to accept advice from other people. So in today's presentation, I'm going to be talking about how people develop their blind spot. Then I'm going to be talking about how it affects people. And lastly, how to overcome it. So let's kick off this presentation with talking about how people develop their blind spot. In an article called What is a Bias Blind Spot, written by Kendra Cherry, she begins to talk about how ubiquitous this cognitive bias is and how many people develop their blind spot. And you'd be shocked to learn that people who regard themselves or see themselves as much higher, the greater this bias tends to be. Let's take a step back and see why this actually makes sense, right? Let's just say you know someone who regards themselves as a logical, rational decision maker, and they only see the good qualities in themselves. Bias tends to be a pretty bad quality, so it's pretty obvious that they're going to omit this characteristic. And what happens when you do this? You make poor decisions. And other factors that increase our blind spot are just other cognitive biases. I know, we can never catch a break. But in a blog written by Jay called The Bias Blind Spot, he talks about the different experiments Emily Cronin, who is the researcher who described this phenomenon, conducted in order to test her theory on a bias blind spot. And upon testing her theory, she came across another bias, and it's called the halo effect. It is when individuals evaluate attractive strangers as more trustworthy. Now, I bet you're sitting there thinking like, what does attractiveness have to do with trustworthiness? Literally nothing. It's just our cognitive bias getting in the way of us making clear decisions. Next, I'm going to be talking about how this cognitive bias affects many people. So, a bias blind spot is actually considered a pretty dangerous cognitive bias because of its ability to distort one's reality. Some people use the term naive realism, which is when an individual sees the world objectively and thinks anyone who disagrees with them is less informed. Coming straight from the source, Emily Cronin basically says in her journal that we're seeing the world through a tunnel vision, and we are noticing other people doing the same thing, but we cannot recognize that we have the bias as well. We can only see the bias in other people. So what happens? It just makes it so much harder for us to accept advice from other people because we're seeing the world so narrowly and we don't want to take in other advice from other people because we think that they're less informed. And another great example comes from an article written by the Financial Express about the complexities of cognitive biases. And one of these examples was about former president of China, Mao Zedong, and his fight to rapidly industrialize China. So he basically forces peasants who no longer own land to work on steel instead of farming. And as a result, a huge famine outbroke. And he tried to quickly solve this problem by utilizing a different technique, which ended up reducing grain production. So many people or many local leaders had to lie about the numbers of grains they were producing in order to please superiors. As a result, many people died, millions and millions of people died, and Mao thought it was for the best of China because he was so blinded by what he wanted that he could not see what was actually going on in his own country. Now the moment we've all been waiting for, how to overcome this dreaded bias blind spot. First thing to do is to just lower that ego. Like, studies suggest that people who believe in total free will and use the term, I'm in charge of the decisions I make, tend to overlook their own biases because they think that the decisions they make are just and can never be biased, right? That's so wrong. And this study was pulled from Chandrasekhar's research. Now, I'm not saying to totally just hate yourself and have super low self-esteem. No, just keep yourself in check and realize that we are all biased, even if you hate to admit it. This is like the first step in overcoming a bias blind spot. Lastly, this one may be a cop-out, but in an article about how most people are unaware of their own cognitive bias, it states to use the same standard that you use on yourself to other people. That's the golden rule of like cognitive bias, right? Slowly you are de-biasing yourself and you're going to start having clear judgment to make better decisions. So let's recap. A bias blind spot is totally invisible to oneself and can distort one's reality, leading them to make poor decisions, and it makes it totally harder for them to accept advice from other people. Now, even though we're all people, we all have biases, right? We have to just accept it and move on and try to find ways to slow it down or to work around them, right? We just got to make sure that we cannot let it fog our brains when it comes to making better decisions. Now, it's kind of too bad I do not have to worry about this, but I know a lot of you guys will learn from this presentation. Thank you.